Hello, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm finding out how many queens I need to beat Stockfish, rated 3200. A lot of you have commented that I should play Stockfish, so let's get started with Game 1. No extra queens. Alright, I think my plan here is just to play solid. I don't have particularly high hopes of winning this game, but I'd like to at least put up a good fight. I have practiced a couple of trial games before actually playing this game, and let's just say that every time I tried to play a little too creatively, I got shut down in about 3 or 4 moves. So I'm just going to play a pretty normal London system and just try to develop my pieces and castle. I've found out that even castling is a great success when you're playing the engine. So we'll go ahead and develop. He's not played anything particularly interesting. He's also playing pretty decent normal development. And one of the major drawbacks of the London system is this b2 pawn getting targeted early on, as it has been already. And usually you can meet that with something like queen to b3 to try to trade off the queens pretty early. And we do get the queen trade. I have the option now to recapture with the pawn or the knight. And normally you wouldn't want to double your own pawns, but in this case it opens up my rook, and I kind of like that idea. So I'm going to take back with the a pawn. And we're met with h6, and we will just continue development. I have the choice between bishop to e2 or bishop to b5, and I kind of like bishop to b5 a little bit better. Put a pin on the knight, some ideas of maybe knight to e5, and we're met with g5. Now, if you watched my last video, I believe, at some point the engine played something very similar to this, where it pushed g5, and it really likes this idea of pushing the light squared bishop back into that little cubby, and then fianchettoing this bishop before castling. I'm not going to overthink it, I'll just push my bishop back. And he plays bishop to d7, so he cuts off the pin. He probably didn't like any ideas of knight to e5. There's also the possibility of moving this knight with a discovered attack on my own bishop. Unfortunately, I can take with check, so I'm not really concerned about that, and I will just castle. Whoa, okay, we're met with g4. This is very unprincipled play. I would definitely scold my kids if they played like this, but I can't scold 3200 Stockfish. Or can I? Maybe I can just make fun of him. Normally this wouldn't be a good move at all, because we haven't finished development, he hasn't castled yet. So I'm curious what his idea is here. Oh, I see. It's that this knight doesn't really have that many squares to move to, and if I push it to e5, he can capture my knight, and even though this is check, he can recapture by dropping his knight back, which wins him a piece. So I have the option of knight to h4 or knight to e1. Which one I like more? Probably knight to e1 by a little bit. Maybe I can reroute to d3. So I'll play knight to e1, and we'll make do with that for now. Wow, and we're met with h5. Normally this is because he has a pawn on d6, and there's ideas of trapping my bishop, but I don't see any way for him to trap my bishop in this position. I'm also looking for trades, because if I can trade off pieces, I can get to a more drawish position more quickly. But the only trade available to me is bishop takes c6, which gets rid of my own light squared bishop and leaves him with a light squared bishop. And you might notice that a lot of my light squares are actually very weak right now. So I'm not really liking that idea. But I can activate more pieces. I can play something like f3 to kind of challenge this idea, and I can open up a file for my rook, and maybe I can actually get my knights back into the game with a recapture. So I'll play f3. And we're met with bishop to h6. He develops with tempo, threatening my knight on d2. And I'm starting to realize that my knights are actually very awkwardly placed. The engine has a very magical way of making your pieces feel very awkwardly placed, very cramped. So you'll notice that my rooks are already disconnected, my knights are disconnected, nobody's defending this knight, and I don't actually have many places to move this knight to. So actually, I can't even defend the knight because the bishop can come to e3 and skewer my rook. And interposing would be very, very uncomfortable because I trap my own bishop, and he can push h4, push my bishop back. I drop the pawn. So I don't have as many choices as I thought. I can only play knight to b1 basically. We're met with a6, kicking the bishop and making me make a decision. Do I want to drop my bishop back, or do I want to trade it off and leave my light squares empty? Seems like a pretty easy decision to me, so I'll drop my bishop back to d3. And he's taking advantage of this weakened square I created by pushing the pawn to f3. He delivers check, and I'm actually more interested in blocking with my own bishop to see if I can trade off this very strong bishop instead of just pushing my king to the side. So I'll play bishop to f2, see if we can get that bishop traded off. He ignores it and he moves to c1. And it's, wow, he's capitalizing very well on the way that he's disconnected my pieces. I mean, my rooks are doing a terrible job of protecting any of the back rank, so he's been able to just drop his bishop down to c1 and start targeting weak pawns, which I really have no choice but to defend with rook to a2. And he moves his bishop back to g5, so it looks like we're in the clear at least for this tempo. Question is, how do I take advantage of that? I need to uncramp my pieces in some way, and I'm kind of liking knight to c2, gets one of my knights off the back rank, and then I have ideas of bishop to e3. The only drawback is that nobody's defending f3, so he could take and then take, and I'm not sure how I feel about this open file on my king. I'm not particularly worried about it though, because we've already traded off the queens, and he has yet to castle, so we'll move forward with knight to c2. And he does in fact capture, so we'll recapture, it's really our only option. And he plays bishop to h3, taking right away advantage of these weakened light squares and forcing my rook out of f1. The natural square to move it to is e1, looking at this e7 pawn with the king right behind it, so I'll play that. And we're met with rook to g8, again, looking at my exposed king side. I could interpose with the bishop, but then I'm just liable to lose it later since it's pinned with something like h4, so I will shuffle my king out of the way instead. He plays bishop to f4, very scary ideas like bishop to g2, then he picks up the free pawn with discovered check, etc. So I probably have to play rook to g1 to defend this square. I could also play bishop to f1. I'm not sure which one I like better. Actually, I prefer bishop to f1 to see if I can just trade off the bishops right away. So I'll play bishop to f1. He does trade, which is good. It takes at least one piece out of the attack for us. And we're met with h4, which is very much an engine move, a very unique engine move. Because, again, the natural human player would castle and then maybe try to control the center, something like that. But engine says no, weak square on g2, and there's no light squared bishop, so naturally I push h4, looking for h3. It is also a free pawn, but I feel like I'd lose more by taking this pawn and opening up yet another file looking straight down at my king. So, for example, bishop takes, rook to h8. If I move the bishop all the way back, I drop h2, and if I move it back to g3, then I drop the bishop because the pawn is pinned. So it's actually a poisoned pawn, I can't even capture it. If I push h3, then g3 becomes extremely weak. You can move knight to h5, knight to g3, very strong outpost if I capture passed pawn, etc. So I think my only option is to allow h3 and to just try to defend it with my rook. So in the meantime, I'll play bishop to e3 to see if we can get a trade. And he ignores it. He uses it as an opportunity to better one of the pieces that he has by playing knight to h5, and if I trade, then he finds knight to f4, and I can never kick that knight out because both of these pawns are missing. So how do I actually address this? My pieces are still very cramped, so I have to work on that basically right away. I'll play knight to d2. He does play h3. He's looking for rook to g2. There's some very scary ideas of rook takes, and if I don't allow that by capturing the bishop, then the knight comes in anyways, which is very scary. But I have to bring more pieces into the game. I'm not going to be able to defend myself if I keep trying to play with the few pieces I have out right now. So I'll play rook to a1. We are met with rook to g2, which leaves me basically no option but to capture the bishop. He recaptures, and now we have to deal with these knights getting hit by the rook. We're no longer under fire on h2, but these two knights are. And I have the option to play something like rook to d1. I say I have the option, but I don't really think I have any other options. So I could play the other rook, but I'd rather bring this rook out of play into play, at least fulfilling some kind of function. And now he pushes e5. This is crazy play. I mean, a normal human player would never push e5 without at least, if you don't castle, at least shuffle the king off the open file. But Stockfish has no fear. He plays e5, and if I capture, he'll recapture. He knows he has me under too much pressure for me to actually create any sort of counterplay. I mean, I can give a check, but then he'll just shuffle his king out of the way, bring his other rook into the attack. So I need to get this knight off of c2, or else I'll never be able to move this knight because it's pinned, which also means I'll never be able to move the rook because he's sitting there defending him. So I'd like to play knight to e3, trying to kick the rook as soon as possible, and unpinning my knight. So I'll play knight to e3. He ignores it. Oh, that makes perfect sense too. He ignores it completely. It's not really forcing at all. If I take, he recaptures with the pawn. It forks my king, it forks my rook, which is horrendous. So I think I just have to give up the pawn. I have to cut my losses on this pawn. And the question is, do I recapture or do I shuffle away right now? I'm going to shuffle away right now and allow him to undouble my pawns. So I'll play knight to f5. He ignores it altogether and he plays knight to d3. Oh wow, he found another threat. Knight to f2 is a fork as well. I was kind of hoping that the pressure that I have on this pawn, because it is a free pawn, quote unquote, right now, would force him to capture, but instead he just threatens another tactic. The question is, how do I actually defend knight to f2 check? I can't shuffle out of the way with tempo because that square is also covered by his knight on d3. None of my knights can defend the square, and as soon as that check comes in, I'm forced to capture with my rook because my king is basically in checkmate at that point. So I have to give up the rook. I have to give up the exchange. Okay, we'll pick up the free pawn at least. We'll pick up the pawn. Oh, that's so funny. He doesn't even capitalize on it right away. He waits to instead capture and worsen my pawn structure, because then I'll have double pawns and an isolated pawn. First, he worsens my pawn structure, and then he'll probably capitalize it. Oh, wow. He doesn't even capitalize on it. He's so confident in this attack. He realizes there's no way for me to actually defend this attack, so he can just sit there with it, keep me under fire. If I ever move this rook, checkmate right away. So he's almost better off leaving his pieces in this position, forever holding my rook to f2, than just cashing in on it right away. And like engines do, suddenly it feels like I have no good moves on the board. I can't take advantage of any of the open files because they're both covered by the knight. I have no way to develop this knight unless I reroute it back to b1 and drop the b2 pawn. I'm so out of options at this point. I can't even offer to trade the rooks because, again, knight to f2 drops checkmate right away. So I'll just buy some time. I'll reroute my knight. Looking at this knight, and finally we get knight to f2. He cashes in on the exchange. And at least now I can give check on the open file. At least we got a check on Stockfish. It's not checkmate, which is what I really want if you read the title of the channel, but it's all right. We got check. And we've been holding out for a while, at least. We did make it to move 36, with a couple moves left to go. Let's play knight to... Oh. See, again, he's done an excellent job. Look at my pawn structure. It's horrendous. It looks like an example of look at all the things you shouldn't do with your pawns. Doubled pawns on this side, isolated pawn, missing king's pawn in front of the king side, and then h2 pawn forever stuck there by the h3 pawn. So it looks pretty clear that he's just going to nick my pawns off one by one, and he's probably got plans of bringing his other rook down to g2 as well, which I really don't have any way to stop other than offering a rook trade, which will probably get me back rank mated in some way. So let's develop our pieces, play conceptual, bring our pieces to the center. Maybe we can tie this rook down to the d5 pawn. He starts taking pawns. I don't even have the choice to activate my rook off the back rank, because in some variations he could, for example, threaten my knight and then look for rook to c1 with checkmate, because this pawn covers g2. So at this point I'm just shuffling pieces. I will just shuffle these pieces and I'll just fast forward through this so you guys can see how it plays out, and I'll do a quick recap at the end. And just a quick pause here, I'm living on borrowed time at this point. I've lost the knight to the h3 pawn because of checkmating threats, and I'm barely holding down the position with my two pieces left, and he's just going to storm me, get a queen, and it's going to be checkmate. So I'll play it out. Oh, wow, that's a really great sacrifice. So there's a rule called, rule of the box, basically, where if I take, he takes, I take. And if you make a diagonal from the pawn to the back rank, and you make a box out of that, if the king can't make it inside this box, then guaranteed the king cannot catch the pawn. So here now when I recapture, there's no way for my king to stop this pawn from queening. And that's it. That sums up round one. Moving on to round two, one extra queen. All right, we're back, one queen richer, and let's go ahead and get started. Now, this obviously isn't my first up a queen challenge. Actually, in my last video, I managed to beat Ding Liren with one extra queen. I have not so high hopes for this game because this bot is rated 500 points higher, but I've learned a couple of interesting things, namely that you should basically expect to give up the queen at some point, and your goal is to get the most amount of material for it possible. So just like normal chess, don't bring your queen out too early because she will get targeted, and try to develop all of your minor pieces first. Then castle quickly, and then look for how to best play with these two queens. So we'll start with normal development. Bishop to f4, everything as standard. e3. Bishop d3, let's offer our first trade. And we got it. We got our first trade. If I can trade off all of these pieces, the queen will be way more felt because it will be noticeable that the queen is one of the few pieces left on the board. We'll continue development. And I'm already trying to finesse some trades here. Maybe I can play bishop to g5. He won't have the bishop pair because we already traded a pair of bishops. There's also bishop to d6, which completely forces a trade, and I really like that idea. So let's go with that, bishop to d6. He does play bishop to e7, and we trade. Let's see, how else can I trade? I can play knight to e5. Maybe if he takes, I recapture, and then we can trade off the queens, which would be huge for me in this position. So let's play knight to e5. And naturally, he ignores it completely. It's really funny watching the engine solve all of the calculation and reasoning that I did in like half a zaptosecond. So he plays queen to b4 because he is not interested in trading queens whatsoever. But I would still like to trade pieces, so I'll trade off the knights. He recaptures, and we have the minor issue of the b2 pawn, which I will just address with rook to b1. He plays back, trying to tickle my queen side a little more, and I'll play pawn to a3. We are met with g6. Now, my king is still in the center, which I'm not particularly happy about, so I'll go ahead and castle him. And he castles as well. Finally, he decides that I have enough pieces that he might actually need to consider castling, which he basically didn't in the last game. I'm going to go ahead and start activating my pieces. It's very tempting here to look for a kingside attack because his squares are very weak, his queen is on the queen side, and he's castled into a very tempting looking position. But I'm going to play it sound and solid. I'll play knight to f3, looking to maybe trade off the knights somehow. He plays knight to f6, probably anticipating knight to g5 with threats of queen h7 checkmate. And we will just centralize our knight on e5. We're met with rook to d8, which supports the pawn, question mark. I'm assuming rook to d8 is actually liberating this knight, because right now this knight is covering d7 from our knight entering. So he plays rook to d8 to cover that square, looking for ideas of centralizing his own knight, potentially. We'll go ahead and activate my second queen with queen to f3, looking for maybe ideas of queen to h3, which would be cool. And he plays c5. This is very principled play. In general, if you're getting attacked on a flank, you want to open up the center as quickly as possible because it destabilizes the attack. And it also makes the position more fluid, so pieces can flow back and forth through the board if the center is open. Whereas if I'm attacking, I want to keep the center closed, so it's harder for him to get pieces from the queen side to the king side, which is where he needs them. We'll play a little tickle tempo with queen to h4, see what he decides to do about this knight, because I'd love to get checkmate on h7 as quickly as possible. We're met with knight to e4, which kind of just invites queen to h3. Obviously, there's this looming fork, but queen to h3 threatens checkmate. So I think I'm going to go with that. Queen to h3 will probably be met with h5, and I'd like to have some sense of how to deal with that. Maybe f3. We allow the fork, and then we enter with the queen, threatening to sacrifice. I think that's actually a really good idea. So we'll play queen to h3. We are met with h5, and we will boot the knight with pawn to f3. Naturally, he capitalizes on the fork, but he's left these squares completely empty. Now the question is, do I go queen to g5 or queen to f6 first? I like queen to g5. f6 isn't really a fork because it drops g6, and queen to b6 wouldn't be a trade-offer like it would be with queen to f6. We also pin the pawn, which allows something like queen to h5 to come soon. So I'll play queen to g5. Very nice. He moves his king out of the pin, which is probably his biggest priority in that position. And I'm very excited about the fact that the queen is all the way on a5. Meanwhile, I have all of these pieces on top of his king. I just have to figure out how to actually take advantage of that. Knight to g4 is super interesting. Clearly, it's a sacrifice. He would never allow me to enter on f6 because that's way too strong. It's devastating. I'd sacrifice the knight and Hail Mary after that. But knight to g4 can't take with the h-pawn because it's pinned. The only option left is taking with the f-pawn. I recapture with my own f-pawn, and I'm just looking to break down h5. f6 doesn't work because our own rook comes into play. He could take this rook, which I would actually ignore. I probably wouldn't recapture so that I can keep this knight, or rather, so I can keep this rook on the semi-open file. It's a bold one, but I think I like it. We're going to play knight to g4. And maybe if we look at game review, we'll get a brilliant move. Or Engine will be like, what was that? That was the worst move I've seen in my whole career. We'll take back with the pawn, and he brings back the knight. How bad can it be? He ignored a fork. So he brings back the knight instead, targets our queen. Obviously, I can't let him take the queen, so maybe I should play something like queen to f4. That way, if g5, I can just enter through f5 with check, and I keep the queen with lots of options. Really, I'm looking to buy time so that I can capture on h5. So we'll play queen to f5. The king retreats, and now we're going to bust this king side wide open. Take that pawn on h5, and he does his best to close it. Absolutely probably the best move. Try to close the position with g5, and we will just slide right past that queen to f5. Finally, he finds a way to bring his queen into the game. I'd like to keep applying pressure, and maybe I can push h6, looking for h7. I'm also mildly concerned about this knight on e4. It's very, very strong. It holds g5, it holds f6. It even holds some of my own squares that I can't really move into. But we'll try that. We'll try h6, see if I can put some pressure on him, actually play a little bit like an Engine ourselves. Engine loves to do that, put pressure, and then just hold it and find a different way to put pressure. So I'll try that myself. I'll play h6. Oh, he captures in the center. I don't know how I missed that. Obviously, this is a completely free pawn. So we'll give check with tempo. He shuffles his king over, and I actually have the option now to give check. If f6, I take the pawn with my queen, and I don't actually lose the pawn. I just want to make sure that I don't have anything better before I play that. I don't believe I do, so I'll move forward with that. Queen to e5 check. f6 is the only move, and we'll take the pawn on d4. Again, for like the third time this game, he turns down the queen trade because he probably understands that with the queen on the board, there's way more ideas of counterattack, whereas if you trade the queens off, it's pretty straightforward crushing. So he keeps the queen on the board, and for the meantime, I'll play c3 to stabilize my pawn structure and make sure that there's no way for him to enter and create counterplay. So I'll play c3. He plays rook to f7. Obviously, he's trying to get rid of this pawn. Oh, I just realized it's actually scarier than it looks. If I play queen to g4, rook takes h7 is not without threat. There's the idea of queen to h2, which is quite devastating. Another idea I could play with is actually sacrificing the rook right away. If he takes back with the knight, I bring my other rook and put pressure on it. He has to defend it, let's say with rook to f8, and then I can play queen to h6, put another attacker on that piece. And I'm a little bit desperate because this is quite scary, and there's not a lot of ways for me to stop that without giving up a queen for example, a rook. So I'll go ahead and take. He takes back with the rook, and I will apply more pressure. He defends, and I think I can freely play queen to h6 to put even more pressure on that rook. So queen to h6, here I go. And he finally defends with queen to e7. I'll go ahead and start by trading off the rooks. He recaptures with the knight, and I believe that just leaves this pawn completely hanging. So I'll take this, and he takes my h7 pawn, which is super interesting because it feels like now I can just sacrifice my queen, and we've entered a fairly even queen endgame, but it should still be winning for me because I can give a bunch of checks and just start picking up pawns. So I'm going to lean into that. I'll take. I'll bite. I'll take. Take back. What? Did he just offer a queen trade? This has to be completely losing. There's no way this isn't completely losing. I have an outside passed pawn, and I'm up 2 pawns, so I'll trade. That's a no-brainer. I'll activate my king right away, and he meets me with opposition, but I will give check. And the issue is here now, I kind of want to try to run away with the pawn at some point. He tries to catch it, and then I run in, and I take all of his pawns instead. Actually, no, I like b3 better first. He can't push. After something like c4, he can't push because I just trade, and then this pawn gets away. So yeah, I can try to make him run out of moves first so that I can enter the position. So I'll play b3. Whoa, b5 is extremely aggressive. He plays b5, and I wonder if I can sacrifice this pawn on e4. Because e4, he takes king to e3. If he tries to buy time, I can just push g5. He comes over, g6, he takes, I take with the king. And then basically whatever he plays, I'm going to beat him to his own pawns. So I'll actually sacrifice the pawn first. Oh, see, he figured it out. He actually ignored the pawn sacrifice. I have to see the game review after this because I hope I got at least one brilliant move. But Engine is probably looking down upon me and thinking if I had an extra queen, I would have crushed you easy peasy, which is true. So I will go ahead and trade this off. He takes back, and I just have to be careful that there's no pawn break. So after something like king to e3, b4, I give check, he moves over a4, and there's no pawn break. So, oh, what about king to e3, a4? Takes. No, that's nothing either, because then I just push my pawn. And by the time he gets all the way over here, this pawn is long gone. So king to e3, he plays king to e5, which is the most challenging move. And I'm thinking we should get g5 on the board and just lower his king away so we can just bum rush his pawns. So we'll play g5, and off we go. We will take with the h-pawn. And let's see, if I take, you play here, I play here, and there's no way for you to stop my pawn, so I'll just take back with this one. He plays the best move, but I will do what's called shouldering, and off goes the pawn. He's off to the races. Very nice. All right, this is basically a guaranteed win. We'll cut off the king, bring our king in, cut off the king again, bring our king, check. He moves back, queen g2, and after king to d3, unstoppable checkmate. All right, so that was actually awesome. I think I'm actually getting better at defeating engines with one extra queen. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I will see you guys next time.